Yes.
Okay. All right, we probably better start because it's running a little bit late. This I don't know whether this will be the last class or whether we'll get two classes out of the material that I'm dealing with here. In a certain way, this is kind of a summary and pinnacle of everything we've been working on for the last 3 years, because the topic for tonight's class, we have finished the 24 theses, and the topic I want to talk about really is the superiority of Thomism as a philosophy. Much of what I'm giving you tonight is borrowed from this work by Père Garrigou-Lagrange, The Essence and Topicality of Thomism, which is an excellent work.
Repeat that title, please.
The Essence and Topicality of Thomism by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, which I guess just came out, what, a year ago?
Not even a year.
Okay, so it's brand new.
You get it through Amazon, and I think it's an on-demand book because it's $30. It's a tiny little book.
That doesn't mean it's on demand at that price. No, it's very...
Hardbound?
Oh, hardbound, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, a little hardbound, but maybe anyway. So, but because there's no publisher on it. There's no publisher on it. You can only get it through Amazon.
That's weird.
That's a mark of it. That's an indication it might be on demand.
Right. Well, at any rate, the importance of this, I mean, we've dealt with the sciences of philosophical psychology, ethics, metaphysics, natural theology. We just finished the 24 theses, Thomistic Theses. And one might ask, even at this point, well, how do we know that Thomistic philosophy is all that good? Because many times people study it and really have nothing to compare it to. In fact, I spoke to a parish priest some years back who said, well, we had St. Thomas in the seminary, and I know about Thomistic philosophy, but he said, I don't know anything about these other philosophies, so I don't know what to say about them. I don't know what to say if they're good or they're bad. And I'm thinking, well, you know, if you really understood your Thomistic philosophy, you wouldn't be making a statement like that.
Excuse me. Somebody told me recently, I was trying to defend Thomistic philosophy, and someone told me that when Thomas was dying, he said that everything he said has no consequence or something.
There's other context.
Yeah, badly. He unfortunately was a wonderful theologian, but a bad horseman.
Who's this?
St. Thomas. Was on the way to one of the councils shortly before he died, he ran into a tree and probably died of a subdural hematoma. And it was after that he had, I think the context was that he had some kind of a divine illumination, some kind of a mystical experience, and then he said that all that he had written was straw. But that's in comparison, compared to the glory of what he had just experienced.
He never said it was wrong. He just said it was
Yeah, and it, I
straw
mean,
compared to the glory of
Didn't he
heaven.
burn some of his?
no. And I mean, again, it's like St. Thomas's response if you ask, what is the next life like? And he says, well, it is simply other. Now, that's not to denigrate it. That's simply to say that we just don't have the means to understand it in this life. It's undoubtedly much, much more real than anything you experience here. But our experience is limited to sensation. All our evidence comes from the senses. But the real question is, why or how can we know that St. Thomas's philosophy is somehow singularly on the mark, superior to what went before, and superior in principle to what comes after, excepting for the developments that come from Thomistic philosophy? In other words, clearly there are things that we know today in terms of philosophy and theology that are developments using the doctrine, method, and principles of St. Thomas to illuminate problems which he did not know about. But we're using his method, we're using his doctrine, we're using his principles. And the superiority of Thomism arises in this. Now, just historically, of course, he used what one might call an eclectic process, but that is, if you see the history of Western philosophy as representing a truly scientific development going back to the pre-Socratics, to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and representing a kind of thinking, a kind of critical analysis that, as far as we know, did not exist on this planet before that time. You have philosophies that have intuitions that are perhaps splendid, but what the Greek mind brought was a scientific approach to the study, to the use of reason in the examination of the world. And with the influence of Christianity, the Christian thinkers of the first millennium developed a superb philosophy reflecting, using the Greek methods combined with divine revelation to give an explanation of the world that had truly never been seen before and really has not been rivaled since. And the wonderful thing about Aquinas is he comes at the end of this period and he synthesizes, he uses all of the thinkers that have gone before. And that's why when you look in the Summa Theologiae or the Summa Concidentiales, he is constantly referring to the great thinkers that have come before and citing them as the sources of what he's doing. Of course, he does more than they do in ways that we will explore now. But in that sense, he represents a culmination of the historical development of all that was good and worthwhile, both in Greek and Christian thought up to that period. And in a very real sense, of course, we see after him a period of decadent scholasticism, which is, as the word suggests, decadent. It was not up to the par that was reached in the 13th century. And then after that period, what do you run into? The moderns with Descartes and all of the errors that ensued thereafter. So in a very real sense, the 13th century represents a pinnacle of human thought, both philosophically and theologically. Doesn't end there because, of course, there were further scholastic commentators, further scholastic philosophers, not the least of whom in the 20th century was Father Lagrange, who, of course, perfected and drew out the logical implications of much of the work of Aquinas. But no single author has ever equaled his capability of synthesizing and originating the best insights that are available to the human mind. What makes Thomism intrinsically of value is that it starts, as all knowledge starts, with sensation. And of course, you find this in Aristotle as well. But if we may move to the level of what Aquinas does, he begins with a defense of the first principles, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, causality, finality. But these are principles of being. The philosophers up to the time of Aquinas had focused on various essential insights. In other words, insights pertaining to the essence of things, talking about the necessity of things or the eternity of things. But Aquinas focuses like a laser on the concept of being as being. And in so doing, which we find in metaphysics, and particularly the principle of existence as opposed to essence. A lot of what he does you find in Aristotle, but Aristotle's work, remember, is what, 16 centuries before Aquinas. It would be absurd to think that nothing developed during those 16 centuries. And our focus is primarily upon Aquinas himself, so I'm not going to try to parse all the differences between Aristotle and Aquinas, but the value of Thomistic philosophy, and we'll focus primarily on that, is that you're dealing with the principles of being right at the outset, immediately derived from the moment we start taking information from our senses, the world around us. The first concepts we form, as it says in the De Ante et Essentia, the first concept we form is being and essence. We encounter something given to us as existing. And the mind simultaneously grasps, I'm not trying to parse the metaphysics of it, but we simultaneously grasp both that there's a certain whatness there and that it is there, that it is existing. So, but all things have in common the act of existence. So no matter what the whatness may be that we encounter, it is always given with being, the concept of being, which is the broadest possible common denominator that all things have. It adds, Thomism adds to this the concepts of potency and act, as we've already seen previously. How are we doing this? It's by applying the principle of non-contradiction in order to solve the problem of becoming that was posed by Parmenides and Heraclitus. Because you have to distinguish between what can be but is not, that is potentiality, and what actually is. Potentiality is on the side of non-being. Of course, act is on the side of being. So you are bringing the principle of non-contradiction to the notions of potency and act. Everything flows from these principles, because then, of course, potency and act is used to explore the entire realm of cosmology, of psychology, of metaphysics and natural theology and ethics. Everywhere you're getting precise distinctions made, and an analysis in terms of powers that represent a potency which may be then actualized, or essence conceived as potency relative to existence, or matter conceived as potency relative to the act which is form. These principles constantly permeate everything and do so with clear distinctions, and that's again using the principle of non-contradiction. What is a distinction? Distinction is to say this is not that. Yes and no. How do you know that a man is essentially different than an animal? Why? Because we possess certain activities the animals don't, being and non-being. And that's why it's clear. And that's why Thomistic philosophy shines an illuminating light upon all that it explores in a way that no other philosophy does. It rejects potency, which is conceived as an imperfect actuality. So you've got to be careful. Potency is really non-being. Act is really being. The problem with people like Suarez and Leibniz is they had a notion of potency as if it were half being. It was imperfect act. It already had an activity. It's already being, but no, it isn't. The whole point of potency is that it isn't. John?
How then do we properly understand Aristotle's definition of motion, an act of being in potency? That seems to...
Because with respect to further act, it is non-being.
Okay.
It's got what it's got, but what it hasn't got, it really hasn't got yet. And the process of becoming is a process of progressively getting perfections you didn't have. And you either had them or you didn't. For Parmenides, being is treated as a genus, a univocal term. And so too we find in Scotus. And that causes some problems because being is not univocal. It is not a genus. It is an analogical entity. So it varies from thing to thing to thing. It's not something that you can predicate the same way, because if you predicate being exactly the same way of the creature as you do of God, you get pantheism, because you make the creature God, or you make God the creature. You can't predicate these terms with exactly the same meaning. Existence doesn't have the same meaning for the creature that it does for God. And yet it is not completely other. Otherwise, God would be and the creature would not be, or the creature would be and God would not be. See, it's not completely other and it's not completely the same. That's the concept of analogy. For Suarez, being is perfectly one, which means it's always actuality, and that's why he can't conceive of pure potency. For him, pure potency is just nothing. But potency is a very real something, because when you're looking at the acorn, it is really potentially the tree, but it's not the tree yet. So it's not absolute non-being, but it is pure potency in reference to what could be, because by pure potency we're talking about matter. The whole material world has in common that any material thing in principle can become any other material thing. And actually, when you think of contemporary physics, what do they tell us? They tell us that the entropy of the cosmos is such that eventually it will die of heat death, and you'll be left with complete homogeneity of subatomic entities that will just be all the same. And that's what you wind up with out of the stuff that we have today. Of course, please notice they always presume that the world will just go on without any interference from anything forever, because they don't have any external causes that they're looking at, like maybe
Just repeat the thought
God.
you started. The whole material world could be anything else?
The whole material, anything that is material can in principle become some other material thing.
And you're saying that's Thomistic?
Well, it's Aristotelian. It's what Suarez doesn't see, because it is a potency that any material thing can, in principle, become any other thing. You could become part of the Rock of Gibraltar. How? You die and we plant you there. Eventually, you're part of it after deterioration. But conversely, we could throw a seed into the dirt that you've become, and up comes a carrot, gets eaten by a rabbit, it becomes a rabbit. That's how material things keep changing, Anything can become anything else. Now, of course, it doesn't retain its form, but it's the matter which is the principle of continuity from this to this to this. And that's what he means by pure potency. It's not absolute non-being, but it's being under a given form, which is at the same time capable of being under other forms by substantial changes. St. Thomas defends the first truths of being and of knowledge, and of course goes beyond the Aristotelian physics to metaphysics in its purest form. Now, of course, Aristotle's got metaphysics. Don't misunderstand me. But what he is understanding is that Aristotle's understanding that the concept of substance can go beyond the substance of material things. And that's why he begins in the physics. Physics is from the Greek word physis, just means nature. So it's a philosophy of nature. And the whole of the philosophy of nature studies the principles that are common to all material things, and ultimately in books 6, 7, and 8 of the physics pursues the explanation of motion and ultimately concludes that there must be a first mover unmoved, so that the concept of being or substance, ousia, goes beyond that of material substance. In that way, he has given us the concept of metaphysics, but it's nowhere near as developed in terms of existence and being as you find in St. Thomas and in his commentary on the Metaphysics. Being inherently transcends physics, inherently transcends the physical world. The concept of being extends to all beings, not merely physical things. It extends to spirit and ultimately leads us to the existence of God as pure act, speaking of potency and act. And this is why the materialists leave us forever mired merely in the physical world. Sometimes I thought when I was studying under Dr. de Koninck that we were forever going to be mired in the physical world, because although he would always say, once you get out of the physics, you can start the metaphysics, but you have to go through the physics to get there, and it seemed like we'd never get through the physics. And that's why he would often poke fun at those metaphysicians who would take out a pen and say, this is a being, and then start talking about the principles of being and so forth. He thought that just was not the way that you should properly go about the approach to physics or metaphysics. Rather, you have to work your way all the way through the physics of Aristotle and the commentary on the physics by St. Thomas, and then begin to get into the metaphysics, which means unless you live to an old age, you'll never get there. But all I know, it seemed to me we never got out of physics.
Was it time well spent?
Oh, yeah, if you like physics. Potency and act divide intelligible being. And remember, intelligible from the Latin intellegere means to read within. Being is intelligible. What does that mean? It means the intellect, which is the same stem, is able to read being. Isn't it an amazing thing that we have a mind that can penetrate being itself? Why should it have to be this way? This is why Maritain suggests that intellect itself is a kind of transcendental. Why would it be that we would have cognitive powers, knowing powers, that are able to penetrate to the very existence of reality and deal with it and think about it and reason about it, and from it draw out the transcendental values of the spiritual and ultimately the first act, which is God? How is it that the mind works that way? I mean, have you ever thought about it? Congress takes it for granted. If we just spend more money, we'll learn more about the world. How do they know that? We know we've done it in the past. I mean, obviously that seems to be a good evidence, but how do you know you're going to keep finding out more if you just spend more money? There's an implicit act of faith there. The mind is able to do this, but in so doing, they're reflecting insights that really are developed by scholastic metaphysicians. It is a realization that in truth, the mind unites with being. It unites with extramental reality. That there is a unity between the knower and the known that is more perfect than the unity between form and matter. That the knower becomes the known in the act of knowing. In an intellective knowing, it becomes the being which it knows. It penetrates beyond the sensible characteristics to the very substance of things and to their very existence. So, applying the principles of potency and act to the intelligible being we experience leads the mind to the proofs for God's existence. And what more fruitful inquiry could we have? I mean, one might say, well, why are you so obsessed with this? I always want to prove God's existence. Well, because God's God. Because God is the source of all other being. And if you want to understand the rest of being, you must understand the truth about God. And you have to understand the truth about God, you got to know the truth about the rest of being. And a philosophy that perverts the truth about creatures will mislead you about the nature of God. Moreover, truth must be immutable. It must be immutable in order for divine revelation in the form of dogma to be eternal, contrary to the claims of the modernists like Blondel. If there's no such thing as eternal truth, how could you have dogma? How could it be permanent? And indeed, St. Pius X, Pope Pius X, in Lamentabili Sani, number 58, gives a false thesis which depicts the essence of modernism when he says, truth is no more immutable than man himself, since it evolved with him and in him and through him. That's the error. That's not the truth. But sounds plausible. After all, where's truth? Truth's found in the intellect. Where's the intellect? It's found in man. What's man doing? Well, man's evolving through time. So if man's evolving through time, truth must evolve through time. This completely undercuts the concept of permanent truth and obviously serrates dogma. No, it's just gone. How can you have dogma if it constantly evolves? And of course, that was the problem with modernism, because it would say, sure, we got dogma. It's the truth as the church pronounces it for now. But 20 years from now, it may be different, because everything's different. Everything has to be read differently, understood differently. This is absolutely corrosive of the concept of dogma and of truth within dogma. Completely contrary to the notion of a legitimate concept of the development of doctrine, wherein you develop a deeper and deeper and deeper refinement of what you already know, but you don't cast aside what you know, you don't contradict it, you don't come to a conclusion that's other and contrary to what you already have established. Legitimate development means development. Like when you grow up, you don't cease to turn into a dinosaur. You become a more and more mature human being. And that's a legitimate concept of the development of doctrine. But it has been misused by modernists because they have tied it to an epistemology and a metaphysics that allows everything to evolve, so that, as Teilhard suggests in The Phenomenon of Man, evolution is not merely a biological theory, but it is a theory which transcends all the sciences: physics, mathematics, metaphysics, philosophy, and theology. Make up your mind. Either you got everything moving with a Heraclitean process, or you have the ability to understand truth that is immutable and eternal. This is why the philosophy is critical. You got the wrong philosophy, you get the wrong doctrine. And this is, of course, why theology builds upon philosophy. And this is why Pius X insisted you had to have 2 years of philosophy and 4 years of theology. Sometimes I think it should have been 4 years of philosophy. But unfortunately, what happened in many cases is, everybody wanted to get to theology. So they go zooming through the philosophy, they're into theology, and they forget they had the philosophy, and they forget what it signified. And of course, unfortunately, one of the byproducts, I guess, of getting nothing but Thomism, and sometimes only out of the book, out of the manual, is you get the mentality of the priest I was referring to earlier in the evening, who just didn't know anything about the other philosophies, and therefore didn't know enough to be able to critique them. I thank God that I got a good Thomistic foundation at the University of Detroit when it used to be a Catholic school. And when I went to Notre Dame, then I got exposed to everything phenomenology, existentialism, positivism, you name it. It was all over the place. Hegelianism, wonderful experience if you survived it. And unfortunately, not everybody survives it. That's the problem. I mean, it's the wonderful notion. It's great to be exposed to everything, provided it doesn't convert you, provided it doesn't lead you astray. But as a result, having been exposed to all this, I've seen the systematic Thomistic synthesis. I've been exposed to all these other aberrant views, and therefore, I'm no longer worried about them. I'm not bothered by them. I'm not in doubt about them. I see their roots. I know what they're based on, and we're going to discuss some of that right now. But the unfortunate thing is people who didn't get the exposure were ripe to fall into every trap that could be posed because they didn't know what they had.
This is just a little historical thing about the roots of our school that I inherited a good bit of Dr. Waters' papers.
Yeah.
And I should bring it in. I should actually send it around to everyone. It was an article written by Father Woodbury, and he wrote it in a newspaper. I think it was in the secular newspaper. And he said, anyone, especially any Catholic, who goes to the University of Sydney and studies under these two men must come to my classes, because these two men are a poison, a cancer in the heart of the university. And so he was openly combating what was going on in the university.
Well, the problem is, and shouldn't be a great shock, that there are people who are very clever in what they write. And I think particularly a good example is Anthony Flou's God, A Critical Inquiry. This was a book he designed for the Canadian undergraduate students, and I dare say it was beautifully written to seduce even the elect if it were possible. Sister?
Could you help me? Truth must be immutable, and you suggested that truth could be refined, all right, without changing the truth?
You can penetrate it more deeply. You can come to understand it more completely, but
so
not...
you're not changing. How is it refined? Can you
You,
give me an example?
you don't contradict what came before. We know things, for example...
Transubstantiation.
Yeah, that was...
Everybody knew that the bread and wine changed to the body and blood of our Lord,
Yeah.
but then we got this scholastic understanding and definition that actually made the teaching for us even more firm.
But it wasn't.
But it didn't teach anything different from what
But
was
we
taught
never
before.
taught anything about that. That was a faith element. When we learned that it becomes the body and blood of Christ. Amen. Nobody ever said, well, it's this way, that way, the other way. Now maybe
But-
scholars
But the church did.
Yeah,
The church did.
historically, that's what you're
Yeah.
saying, historically. It was understood that the body and blood of Christ were present in the Eucharist, but it took time to develop and apply the scholastic terminology of transubstantiation dogmatically applied to this understanding, so that it could no longer be misunderstood, but it would be unintelligible, the definitions of Trent, except in terms of Thomistic philosophy. You can't translate that into some other philosophical lexicon and have it still mean what it means. And if it doesn't mean what it means, you have denied the dogma. So I think of develop in a more secular context. Consider what we know about ethics. Today, we're running into all kinds of bioethical questions, especially concerning procreation, that we didn't know 100 years ago. But you still apply the same basic ethical principles of natural law, the nature of the act, the end of the act, the application of double effect. These principles still are applied in order to understand the laicity, the legitimateness of some new technical process that's been developed that didn't exist before. I mean, we weren't able to clone the sheep dolly until relatively recently. It wasn't an issue. But having done it, then the question arises, well, is it legitimate to do this with human beings? Now, that's a question that just didn't exist before because you couldn't do it. And you then apply the principles of Thomistic natural law to this new process, and you find out you shouldn't be making sheep out of men. Something to this effect. All right, to come. The immutable first principles, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, causality, are needed in order to prove the existence of God. We use them as the bases for determining moral obligation. In other words, you're always using the principles. How? In ethics. Double effect, remember? What are you talking about? You're talking about maximizing being. You're acting for being. You're trying to get away from non-being. You seek good, which is being. You avoid evil, which is non-being, relative to the nature of something. So you're still applying the metaphysical insights. I remember I hadn't taught ethics at the undergraduate level for most of my career until around 1990, and I wasn't sure. I didn't feel terribly competent about doing it. And I remember Dr. Waters saying to me, "Look, you know metaphysics. If you know metaphysics, you'll be fine in the ethics." Because it's an unerring guide. You're constantly maximizing being. You're constantly acting so as to fulfill natures, and in fulfilling natures, you're giving the greatest actuality to a nature. You're affirming the actuality, which is to affirm the being. And you avoid perversion, which would be to deviate from the nature and towards away from the nature, which means away from the being as the thing is intended to be by its creator. That tells you where you don't go in ethics. So the principle of being and maximizing being underlies ethics. You can't just say, "Hey, I'm going to do ethics." That's what a lot of people wanted to do when I was going through graduate school. A lot of people said, "Oh, I want to be an ethician," and they'll just go off and study ethics, like it existed in a vacuum. And that's why you wind up with pretty absurd ethics, because it's just somebody's master insight. Usually it's utilitarianism. Usually it's that the end justifies the means. If you get a good enough end, that's the right thing to do, and then you can write tomes about this, but you don't understand anything. You don't understand why we're not allowed to do that. Natural law is based upon the first principles of being. The philosophy of being, unfortunately, in the hands of some, since in the modern period, has been replaced by a philosophy of action, of the phenomena, or of becoming. And that's why you get the absurdities that you find in process philosophy, that you find in, what am I thinking of? Bergson. There's somebody who isn't even that well known today, but had a profound impact upon the modernist. The kind of things that you find in somebody like Teilhard de Chardin. Not Kierkegaard. That's going a different way. But if you replace the philosophy of being with a philosophy of action, what you're doing is replacing the stability. I don't want to say that you get from Parmenides, because he's got the univocal notion of being, but you replace the stability that you find in Aristotle or in Aquinas, where there are constant natures of things, even though they're varied in individual circumstances, but there's a stability of nature. Well, for example, an act of murder may vary as to whom you're killing or how you kill them and so forth, but it's still essentially the same act, the deliberate and unauthorized taking of an innocent human life. There's a commonality that is permanent. But in a philosophy of action, well, then you get something like situation ethics. Well, it looks like murder at one time. Later on, well, it's not really murder because you're doing it with a loving motivation, as Dr. Fletcher would say. You're trying to produce a greater good. And if you really have a feeling for people, you'll do what makes the most people happy, rather than worrying about some old archaic principle that is immutable like a piece of rock and as hard-hearted at the same time. They don't understand that what is intrinsically evil can never be made good. You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and you can't make the deliberate destruction, say, of an unborn child, something whereby you will produce a better society, however tempting it may be. You replace the philosophy of being with a philosophy of the phenomena, which subjectivizes everything, so that the laws of being no longer apply transcendentally. They only apply within subjective experience. And from that, you see, you're getting that from Immanuel Kant, and it goes into the absolute idealists of the 19th century. It goes into the phenomenologists, such as Edmund Husserl, and it proceeds then into the existentialist. And everything becomes subjectivized. But authentic metaphysics is realistic. It insists that there is an extramental reality and that we must conform our minds to that, and that reality must conform to that. And natural law means that an ethical system that conforms to extramental reality and is not overwhelmed by subjective values and experiences and emotion. It recognizes the value of all things in their proper place, but it doesn't let emotion carry us away to the point that we commit an act that is intrinsically evil in order to make us feel better. The philosophy of being gets replaced with the philosophy of becoming. That's what your process philosophy and your process theology is. And that, of course, is why the theory of evolution had such an impact in terms of the development of modernism and in terms of the development of the process philosophies, because you got the tail wagging the dog. You got a biological theory being used as by Chardin as the fulcrum, the pinnacle insight that governs every other science.
To which all systems must bow.
Yes. Could not put it more clearly, to which all systems must bow. Well, what you've done is you got the insight of radical becoming determining everything. And of course, this casts aside the immutability of being. And that's why the process philosophers were always poking fun at natural law, because they say that these people are thinking in the Stone Age. They got everything permanent. They borrowed it from Aristotle. They got essences, the notion of an essence that is absolutely frozen in time and can never encounter adequately the real world we live in, which is a world of becoming and change and novelty and progress. It's an overwhelming language that wins the war simply by sheer verbiage. But it doesn't, again, make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. It doesn't refute the beautiful demonstration that we find in Garrigou-Lagrange's God, His Existence and His Nature, Volume 1. He's got a whole set of footnotes on one page, and the footnotes simply show all of the absurdities of a philosophy of pure becoming. Because you can't even define becoming. Becoming means this becomes that, but there isn't any this to become that, because this would be something with an essence, and there's no essences to do it. Worse than that, it attacks the postulate of what they call a postulate of morcellation, which means putting things into bits. They accuse traditional philosophy of doing this. But then it says everything becomes. Well, if things become, that means this becomes that, and that means there's a distinction between the before and the after. But if there's a distinction between the before and the after, one is not the other, heaven forbid you got morcellation. In other words, you can't make sense of becoming if you don't distinguish the before from the after. And if you distinguish the before from the after, you've said one is not the other, and the principle of non-contradiction applies. But these people actually deny the principle of non-contradiction, as absurd as that may seem. They say that those first principles freeze reality and do not do it appropriate justice. They cast them aside, but the problem is you can't have a philosophy of becoming except if you understand it in terms of the distinction between the before being different than the after, which means one is not the other, which means you're using the principle of non-contradiction. And Lagrange has a whole set of examples like this, but that is perhaps the most clear and simple one from my small brain to grasp. Also, these philosophies that replace the philosophy of being are based on a denial of the adequation of the mind to being. Remember, it is critical to the Thomistic synthesis that the mind knows being, knows extramental being. It is realistic. Modern philosophy is not realistic. Modern philosophy is subjectivistic. Modern philosophy got taken over by what Kant did. And as much as I really don't get that excited about the history of philosophy, but you can't understand the box we got ourselves into when we accepted the distinction between the mind and images, or the image and the thing that Descartes gave us. And then we got into the skepticism of David Hume, who said, well, all you know are the images within you. You never know the external reality. And then Kant comes along and says, well, we'll save the appearance of external reality because we'll have universal laws that govern everything that takes place in our mind. So, this has become Alice in Wonderland. You have as many philosophies as you have philosophers because they all are defining different worlds within their minds. That's the whole point of Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland. Charles Dodson, Lewis Carroll is poking fun at the 19th century idealists, because once you can have any set of subjective realities that your system produces, you've got your own Wonderland, and everybody's got a different one. So you can have things happening in one land that doesn't happen in another. They're all consistent with whatever the premises you started from. But nobody's obliged to start from being that doesn't allow you to hypothesize your premises. And remember, you got stuck internally because of what happened with Descartes, Hume, and Kant. George?
When I use the word Alice said, it means exactly what I wanted it to be, neither more nor less.
I think she had a problem with the caterpillar, too.
Oh, yes.
So the adequation of the mind to being was subverted by Hume and subverted by Kant. And what happens after Kant, where, because he has now subjectivized philosophy, philosophy is the rules of the mind. It's the rules of the mind. Everything I experience in the world of physics, is universal and valid because I have these a priori forms of all possible cognition within my mind governing them. So causality works. Cause and effect works. For Hume, it doesn't. Remember, Hume's skeptical, says there's no way to determine that cause and effect as mental impressions necessarily are associated. And Kant says, well, that's true if you're talking about the extramental reality, but I'll guarantee that they're associated because we have built right into our mind a necessary connection, a rule, an a priori form, a filter that guarantees cause and effect will always be connected. But the catch is it holds good only for my subjective experience. And that's why Kant's philosophy condemned modern philosophy to this whole subjective approach to things, which led, in the person of Fichte, to an out-and-out pantheism, which led in Hegel to a notion of absolute evolutionism. Now, Hegel's beautiful. I mean, you start with the concept of being, and then being somehow magically begets non-being, and he doesn't really explain how, being and non-being act together to produce becoming. And you're often running into Heraclitus again. You're often running into a world in which everything's becoming and proceeding. How on earth he goes from being to non-being to becoming, God only knows. But of course, in some of these philosophies, you become God. You enter into solipsism and you are God. Also, of course, from Kant, poor Kant, you get phenomenology. You get Edmund Husserl. Why? Because we are trying to develop a metaphysics by describing the content of subjective experience, and hope to heaven that somehow it gets you to some kind of a transcendental philosophy. See, what you're getting is some master concept. It isn't the very basic common sense being grounded reality that you find in Aristotle or Aquinas. It's a master concept, a master insight that somehow everything you know is what is subjectively experienced, and you've got some peculiar angle on it that you're going to base your whole philosophy on. And curiously, for that reason, sometimes what happens is the philosophy becomes a philosophy of only part of reality. So you may have a philosopher whose philosophy is only metaphysics, or it is only ethics. It isn't really a system which covers all the various sciences that you find in Aristotle or in Aquinas. Phenomenology gives birth to existentialism. It's from Husserl that you're led to Heidegger and to Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Camus, most of whom were atheists, curiously enough. Most of whom died young, too, rather tragically, Merleau-Ponty and Camus. But suddenly you get curious insights. I mean, look at Sartre, as he says himself. When he was about 14 years old, he was just sitting there thinking to himself, he thought, well, what if God didn't exist? What would the nature of the world be? And he committed himself to that. The whole of his philosophy flows from the logic of God not existing. And then you try to develop a metaphysics out of this, instead of beginning with what is given in sense experience and the first principles that are evident to every human being, and using these common sense principles in a sophisticated way that leads the mind inexorably through the application of potency and act back to the first prime and pure act, which is God. No, he starts with a simple insight. God doesn't exist. Of course, he's inherited the entire panoply of Christian thought that would developed over 2,000 years. It's like Descartes. Where does he get the notion of God from? He got it fully developed from the medieval period. It didn't come out of nowhere. But they suddenly take this insight. I've got this notion of God. God doesn't exist. And then man just gets thrown into the world and suddenly finds himself here, and his meaning is his own project, whatever it is he chooses to be. You talk about getting a master insight and then developing the whole thing from it. This would be an example. And it's only as good as the starting point. The problem is the starting point has to be critically looked at. How do you know that there's man? How do you know that we're in a world? Where did the world come from? What is the nature of the world? The early Greek philosophers dealt with a very realistic approach to a world which was given, and they wrestled with trying to understand how can there be change, how can there be coming, but they didn't start with the absurdity of a purely subjective, essential insight taken uprooted from the world and then build an entire philosophy on it. They started with a very common sense, common experience that all human beings have with, I love that phrase, the natural metaphysics of human intelligence. They didn't start with super bubble gum. They started with that which was quite realistic and reasonable as a starting point. But this is how you get today philosophies that are started up, as it were, almost from thin air, with some simple primary insight, a master insight, and everything flows from that. But if you challenge the master insight, they got a problem. Challenge Hegel as to what is becoming. How do you understand becoming? What does it mean? And anybody who says, well, you don't use the first principles of being, the difficulty is that they're not only the principles of being, they're also the principles of thought. You can't think without either affirming or denying a predicate of a subject. Now, that the principle of non-contradiction in the logical order is that the same predicate cannot be affirmed and denied of the same subject. You can't play around with those things and still say anything intelligible. And that's why, if you're going to attack the first principles, how do you write a book? How does Kant, or how does Hume, who's very skeptical of causality, how does he write a book and avoid words like because or since in English? It's very difficult, because we do give reasons for things. You can't help it. If somebody just makes an assertion and you say, well, how do you know that? You're demanding a reason. And demanding a reason means you're applying the principle of sufficient reason. If you can't come up with a sufficient reason for what you're saying, nobody's going to listen to you. And thus, all of these philosophers have to speak in terms of the first principles and have to reason according to the rules of logic that they did not invent. So even if you're presenting some very, shall we say, original philosophy, a bold insight, you still must present it using the mechanisms that were developed and understood by all men in terms of logic and communication, the meanings of words, the distinction between affirmation and negation. These we can't do away with. And that's because the laws of being are also the laws of thought and the laws of communication, the laws of logic. The difficulty, as Father Lagrange puts it, these other philosophies we see today, they're based on a kind of mother idea, which itself is incapable of explanation. So many times they'll just say, you've just got to think about it, get the insight that's behind what I'm saying. And if you don't get the insight, you just will never understand the philosophy. I think of the course I sat in on, didn't actually take the course, but it was from A. Robert Caponigri, who was complaining. Actually, what he was doing, he was telling us about the logical positivists who were running all over Europe and running into all the classical philosophers, and they were constantly asking them whenever they started their philosophy, they say, what do you mean? What do you mean? And they drive them nuts and drive them crazy. And therefore, ultimately, you after about a week of this, you got the idea that you don't dare say, what do you mean? And then he started his own philosophy that he was teaching, and we were all tempted to say, what do you mean? But nobody dared say a word. We've been conditioned to not saying it. But that's some of these philosophies are like that. They do need to be elucidated as to what do they mean. It's just that the guys that were saying, what do you mean, were linguistic analysts who had their own difficulty because they restricted all knowledge to actually positivistic foundations so that no terms have meaning if they're not empirically verifiable. Thomism depends on this natural metaphysics of human intelligence, which affirms that there's such a thing as objective truth, and that there's an objective truth of first principles that are founded in an intellectual understanding that originates in sensation, in the givenness of extramental realities known in the act of sensation, understood by the mind according to metaphysical first principles that are universal, immutable, and eternal, and which lead us to the transcendental realities of things like spirit and God. That's why Thomism is superior to these other forms. And I might add one thing, we're going to have to close for tonight at least, but think about it for a moment. All of the things, the insights that were developed up until you get to Aquinas, were various essential structures or systems of philosophy. But what Aquinas adds is he suddenly says, wait a minute, the ultimate principle here is whether these things are real, that is to say, whether they have existence. It was Aquinas who he may not have originated the distinction between essence and existence, but he certainly expressed the importance of it and recognized that the act of existence is the ultimate act. Now, if you think about it, what could you add to that in terms of a new philosophy? You've discovered the root act of existence against which every essence is counter-distinguished. And if that is so, and if the only reality you have is measured by existence, what philosophy could you have beyond this? You could elucidate further what the implications of what's already been shown, but you're not going to come up with some kind of an essential system that can operate in contradistinction to or to replace an existential metaphysics, which is the ultimate rule of anything. The act of existence. Is something real or is it not real? What is the existence that it's based on? And that's the reason why you can have other developments that perfect what Aquinas achieved, but they can't really come up with a completely new philosophy that will replace it, because to do so they'd have to replace reality itself. Okay, that's all we have time for tonight.
Sound production copyright Oltine Library Services, all rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com